I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we examine what just happened in our provincial election. We should probably start at the beginning. What happened to the BC Liberals? I was elected in 2005 as a BC Liberal, which at the time represented a coming together of the more central Liberals and the Conservatives of BC. But as we mostly know, it was not a happy or easy coalition. I doubt I went anywhere in my role without those who were more conservative complaining about the name. They hated the Liberal label, and they were definitely not federal Liberals. So I'm not going to jump on Kevin Falcon and blame the loss of the election on the name change. Obviously, it wasn't handled well and surely not marketed well. But what now? I served when Gordon Campbell had a slim majority, and that meant that when the legislature was sitting, we had to be present in the building until 9 p.m. in case the opposition introduced a surprise motion of non-confidence. When that happens, the bells ring and everyone present runs to the legislature before the doors are locked. If someone's sick or maybe they've gone off to dinner, the government can fall. Premier Eby is in a much more precarious situation. And even though he and the Greens may be friendly on a number of issues, what happens to LNG expansion when the Greens oppose it? Or involuntary care for those with severe mental disabilities? So good luck to Premier Eby. It's not going to be easy. He indicated he listened to voters. But has he? To discuss this election and what our government is going to look like going forward is someone who's watched every moment of this drama. Rob Shaw is the senior political reporter for CHEK TV, and he'll join us after this break to assess the situation. Rob Shaw joins us now, and Rob, you have had a much closer look at what was going on with this election. But I'll tell you, it's had my head spinning. And the night of the win, I was so surprised to see Premier Eby stand up and say, well, this was an election for the Progressives, we won. Mm-hmm. I didn't see the election that way, did you?
No, I saw an NDP leader who squandered a majority given to him by John Horgan, all the advantages of being in power, all the electoral and financial advantages, and barely scraped by in the end of all the recounts by a 27-vote, one-seat majority. And there is an effort underway by New Democrats to sort of describe this as a heroic victory for the ages because they stopped what they see as this blue wave of conservatism. But I think the anger that the public is feeling on some key issues is really a big reflection of how the NDP is done.
So how do you think, when he's not before the cameras, Premier Eby is dealing with this?
Well, he's a guy who likes to control things, and he likes to proceed on his own initiative and his own gut feeling and his own, ideas. And I've watched him as Attorney General and Housing Minister in the past, and he doesn't listen to the civil service without sort of really stress testing them. He pushes them to get the facts that he wants to have in front of him to make decisions. And he ran his premier's office the same way. And I think he's dealing with a shifting reality where he won't be able to govern that way anymore. And that will be a challenge for him because he has things he wants to do. His whole political career, he's been able to do them. And now he's stuck in a position where just barely hanging on to power. And it'll be a gut check for him.
Is he chastened?
Not publicly. I listen to his speeches publicly, and I hear him say that he has received a message from voters to do more of what he was doing faster. That may, in fact, be their interpretation of it. I guess that's the open question right now, is the things that David Eby did for 22 months as premier, housing reforms, some healthcare recruitment changes, did he just not have enough time to get those into the results that voters wanted to see in 22 months, and so he has to double down now. I think that's where his thinking is, and in that sense, the New Democrats view this as just, we have to do what we were doing harder and faster and more immediate in some key areas, not necessarily change direction.
But what about the other side of that? You look at decriminalization and safe supply. That was his baby. It was his experiment. He wanted to do it, and it blew up in everybody's face in terms of the disorder that we saw in our streets. So he pulled back a little bit and asked the Prime Minister to recriminalize in certain public spaces. But did he not see that some of the things he did, the Land Act, for instance, were in fact against what the public wanted?
No, I don't think New Democrats did, and they have this blind spot that occurs in governments of certain ages where they view the initial round of criticism on decriminalization, on street disorder, on Indigenous reconciliation as weaponization by their enemies. And I watched decrim build from day one through, and through most of that, the NDP refused to acknowledge that it was really happening. And instead they said people were fear-mongering, stigmatizing those with addictions, stigmatizing those who are unhoused, and trying to play politics. And they misconstrued what was public anger coming through the opposition parties with just the opposition parties playing politics, which they were doing. And so they were completely misreading the public for much of his tenure as premier.
So it's not that the public was saying, oh, we love what you're doing, do it faster. And there were a couple of big areas that they said, no, we didn't like that.
Well, affordability has become the lens through which almost all of government is being viewed now. So the carbon tax is something that I think the NDP wanted to keep, and the cost of living crisis has just forced them to have to abandon that because the conservative axe the tax movement was so strong. So there are some elements that are washing away things the New Democrats would prefer to do. There are some things they're realizing they have to change, and there are some things that have yet. I mean, they're ticking mayors off in the housing sector, or they're ticking some communities off in certain areas of their housing policy. They still think those are right. So they haven't entirely changed their approach. They're just sort of waiting for the next round of criticism, I guess.
And so this is a very tenuous situation. And I'm sure on some votes, they're going to have to rely on the Greens. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. So what does that mean for some of the specific issues that we're talking about? I would assume the Greens would like to continue the decriminalization movement. So does that come back, or do they manage to get through with that one?
Well, it's an excellent question because the Greens are going to try to pull the New Democrats left and away from what the public sentiment was in the election. So the more deals the NDP cut to get Green votes by increasing the carbon tax, by moving the way the Greens want on regulating and distributing more supply of drugs to deal with the addictions crisis, it's the opposite way that the voters indicated in the election they want the government to go. So we have the NDP with a 1-vote majority. They'll name a speaker. They'll be in a tie if the Greens and the Conservatives oppose them. The speaker will break the tie, which not supposed to do, but they'll do it anyways. And I think the NDP will view the Greens as kind of a backstop against bringing the government down on some just sort of general confidence motions. But they'll probably have to cut a deal on healthcare, on the Green Plan for healthcare, which was more community centers. And they'll probably have to do some more environmental movements for the Greens. But they're certainly not going to give the Greens everything the Greens wanted, which if the NDP hadn't won that last seat in the recount, they would have had to cut a deal with the Greens for a lot more. And the Greens are kind of diminished in their power now.
I think the Premier has some protection on the carbon tax because all he ever said was, if the feds get rid of it, then we'll follow through. And there's no indication right now that the feds are going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Although who knows with the federal system either what's going to happen. But and so he could just quietly let that one sit. But something like LNG, where the Greens are very vocal, especially one particular member, saying no new LNG, period. And yet we've got Kitimat, we've got other areas that are all waiting.
Yeah,
What's going to happen?
Well, you could argue that the Green, Jeremy Valeriot, who was elected in West Vancouver Sea to Sky, was elected on the message of opposing LNG, and that was his primary, it was what he was running under, essentially. And you see the New Democrats despite John Horgan giving a massive tax break, billions of dollars to encourage LNG over the finish line, no one in this government is celebrating LNG Canada starting to bring its first train online, or the completion of pipelines, or even Site C, which is now getting its turbines up and going with its reservoir filled. So that part is very fascinating to watch because, as you know, and others who watch the economy, those are job generating, economic generating, GDP generating projects that the government needs, especially with the budget so far in the red, but they're unwilling to support them publicly in a way. And so it puts them in a position on LNG of supporting it behind the scenes, but not publicly. And maybe they can make some type of agreement with the Greens on that. The Greens don't want any more fossil fuel production, any more fracking, any more pipelines, any more LNG. But I think that's kind of unrealistic for the NDP to see through.
And as you indicate, that's our economy. And our economy is having a lot of problems now. And a lot of those big projects are now done for the most part in terms of the infrastructure jobs. So what's going to happen with the economy? I mean, this is not a business government.
No, well, we didn't hear a lot really about economic generation and economic growth in the election. We heard a lot about plastic straws and, instant rebates, $1,000 checks and things like that. The Conservative plan had a very ambitious economic growth target. I think it was 5.4% or something like that. And the NDP don't have that. And it is an open question as to how they plan to balance the budget with the record deficit they're running. There is no timeline to balance it. And you will know, well, how hard that can be for a premier who did not really curtail spending in any way and has not grown. I will say, he has talked about mining. That may be an overlap area with our premier, mining of critical resources, rare earth minerals, the things that are needed for batteries and solar, that type of thing. But outside of that, there's not a lot of big economic projects the NDP support.
No, and as you say, once you get into this deficit, running deficit, adding deficit, oh my gosh, it's hard to turn the ship around. We're going to continue with Rob after this break and have a look at what the Conservatives are up to. We're trying to take a good look at what we've got as a provincial government going forward. And we're speaking with Rob Shaw today. And Rob, before we get to the Conservatives and what they're up to, I felt that during the election, the Premier was trying to get more into the centre. And it didn't seem like that's where he really wanted to be, but it was maybe to get votes. And now maybe the Greens will be a good excuse for him to go back to where he's comfortable.
It's possible. I think the NDP are really hoping to at least get a couple years out of this minority government and then recalibrate where the centre is and whether they need to be there. They are hoping, I think, that we'll have a federal election where Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives will, looks like, be elected and kind of be a pressure release valve on some of the conservatism that we saw in British Columbia in this provincial election. And I think their long-term hope is that if Poilievre is elected, and a year or two go by, perhaps even, that people will be less likely to confuse him with the next Conservative leader or the current one in BC and instinctively vote for the Conservatives. And then maybe he won't have to make the same sort of shifts against his nature that he
You agree his nature is more comfortable further left?
He is a guy who believes that the government has a very big role in solving all of our problems. More programs, more intervention, more regulations, more. So, yes, he's a big government premier, and he views the state as the mechanism to get things done, which is ideologically quite different from the centre right, who try to remove the government and let the private sector kind of pick up and go.
I was so disappointed during the election at how nasty it was. I haven't seen one like that. All the personal insults. What did you think?
It was this is my fifth election. It was the nastiest, and I think the least honest by all parties. There was a lot of things that were said that were categorically wrong. The Conservatives are going to cut $4 billion from healthcare. Completely incorrect. The NDP are going to put free drugs on all store shelves. Completely wrong. Just a continuation of that throughout the election. There was a time, and you remember this in politics, where if you confronted someone in an election campaign with a patently false misrepresentation of something, they would at least kind of walk it back a little bit, or you call them out. No, there was none of that in this election. And it's I think a sign of our media environment changing, of a lot of social media campaigns, a lot of unchecked rhetoric, and it was, if you were a voter, it was very confusing. But we see some exit polls coming out now that say most people decided, according to the surveys, of how they're going to vote before even the election campaign began, before the TV leaders debate, which we consider a kind of pivotal moment. I think 69% of people surveyed by Navigator made up their mind before the TV leaders debate. So in that sense, maybe the campaign didn't make that much of a difference. Maybe a change election by frustrated voters, they just tuned out all the mudslinging and the lies and voted the way they wanted to in the first place.
I had hoped it would at least end with the election. But even after winning, Premier Eby was making some comments about an issue and immediately turned to those racist, homophobic, et cetera, et cetera. You referred to it in a wonderful column you wrote for Vancouver's Awesome. It's going to keep going?
I think so. David Eby has talked about a bright line test, as he calls it, of candidates, conservative MLAs, who he's not going to work with. And he's mentioned Brent Chapman in Surrey South, who had made some controversial social media posts in the past about Muslims and residential schools. And so he is, I think, walking a line here saying the voters have indicated to us they want action, they want the legislature to work, they want cooperation, but I'm only willing to cooperate with certain people. And he is continuing to sort of wedge the issue of the election and the idea that some conservatives are unfit to be in office as a reflection of their leader, John Rustad. The two-part attack is this person is racist or homophobic, and John Rustad should be doing something about it. And so it's a double attack by the New Democrats to continue to portray Rustad as weak and unfit to be premier. And, you know, I'm sure that there are a lot of New Democrats who believe it too, because there are very offensive comments by some conservative candidates who have really failed to apologize in a meaningful and effective way to the communities they've hurt. And they failed to do the work to educate themselves. And that is a reflection on them and John Rustad for not requiring that. And you know from politics that it is not just about issuing an apology statement. It's about actually doing the work to have validators say that in those communities you offended that it's okay. And the Conservatives haven't done that.
So let's look at the Conservatives from nowhere, basically, up to almost winning government. How do you see it?
Well, there was a bunch of streams that came together, some luck, some chance, some things that occurred between, I think, Kevin Falcon's leadership race, in which a candidate named Aaron Gunn, he was a right-wing sort of a YouTuber, was disqualified from the leadership race for the BC Liberals. And a whole generation of young Conservatives found themselves disenfranchised with the BC Liberals. They went off, they created the BC Conservatives, they gave it the same branding, the same logo, the same common sense change message as the federal Conservatives. John Rustad ends up fired from the Liberals over some comments, goes over here, and they start to pick up this momentum. And they just, whether it's confusion, whether it's luck, although you have to be good to be lucky, John Rustad worked the province behind the scenes for a year. He was telling me he would just go to weddings in Surrey. People would invite him to weddings, and he would show up to their weddings. He would do these basement events. He worked behind the scenes to make connections. And the result was that the Conservatives had enough momentum to essentially, at a certain point, force BC United to collapse, which was extraordinary to watch. And I think they could have won this election. It was within their grasp to win a majority, and for various reasons, including candidate vetting, and the fact that they were building their airplane as flying it without a lot of the tools or expertise of the past.
No infrastructure, no money.
No voter ID. They had no lists. They had money at the very last minute. They couldn't get pamphlets out to people in time. There were candidates who, no one even knew who they were. And some judgment decisions on not taking the former BC Liberal United candidates they could have taken and replacing some of the Conservative candidates they should have replaced. And that led to some vote splitting in a couple ridings that the Conservatives could have won.
So what has John Rustad got to work with? How is he going to be as opposition leader?
This is an interesting question. Some people view him as in a weak position, and he's going to face some leadership challenges and people who want to get rid of him. I don't actually think so. I think by sticking with some controversial candidates and refusing to sort of fire people in the election, he's engendered a lot of loyalty in his caucus, and he will be able to be opposition leader for at least a couple years if he wants. Whether he wants to is another question. And he has a very large, very vocal, but very inexperienced opposition caucus of 44 MLAs, and he will have to rely, I think, on the united incumbents, of which I think there are four of them, 4 or 5. People like Peter Milobar, who will be helpful as a House leader. Eleanor Sturko will be helpful as a critic, and that type of thing. Trevor Halford. So he's got a front bench, a small front bench, and a big pool to draw upon of some very interesting candidates, Linda Hepner, people who've won, who have other electoral experience. And they'll be a formidable opposition, but it'll take a while to get them going.
And so what do you think about the BC Liberals? Will they come back? No.
There was a lot of talk in the election about a feeling like some people wanted a centrist option, and the Liberals would have been that option. But our electoral history shows us that if you don't unite the center-right, you split enough votes to allow the NDP to win, and that's sort of... So if the Liberals had continued in this election, I think there'd be a lot of pressure to remove them from the electoral map anyways. And it's possible someone gets behind them and tries to resurrect them, but we're in a very polarized political environment right now. And it's reflected not just in BC, but across the country, in the United States. There's a lot less willingness to work in a coalition of social and fiscal moderates to conservatives. And it'll be harder. It'll be harder than when Gordon Campbell did it, I think, to unite the right, because it's a different environment and it's much more polarized.
And it's such a skinny situation for Premier Eby.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob, for giving us your perspective. We'll all be watching closely to see how this evolves.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Back in a moment. So here we are, the NDP with a bare majority trying to govern. The only way a government falls is over a motion of non-confidence, for instance, on the February budget. Personally, I don't believe the Greens would be willing to force another election so soon. However, it will be vote to vote on what gets passed or sidelined. How will this end? Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.